Forget everything you've seen on television and in the movies. There's not going to be any last-minute surprise witnesses. Nobody's going to break down on the stand with a tearful confession. You're going to be presented a simple fact.
Welcome to the Structural Engineering Podcast. This week we're doing an episode I've wanted to do for a long time, and that is structural engineering and the law. We all know there's been some structural failures in the news over the past few years, and at some point we'd like to dive into those as well. But for now, we want to learn about the reality of lawsuits in engineering. I've heard countless references and rumors regarding how often engineers are sued, why, and how maybe we can protect ourselves a bit. Our guest this week...
Hi, I'm Sam Mcglamery.
Sam has been practicing engineering for longer than I've been alive.
I have about 42 years of experience as a consulting structural engineer.
Sam has worked all over, but generally has been based out of Denver, Colorado. He started his own firm and eventually merged with a much larger Vertex. He served as the executive VP of engineering for a number of years and now focuses on both mentoring, as well as what we're here to talk about, standard of care and expert witness work. I have no idea how we got Sam to share an hour with us, but it wasn't something I wanted to waste, so I threw every paranoid question I've ever heard about our industry's risk of lawsuits, and I have to say, it doesn't sound nearly as bad as I had imagined. My first question for Sam, really, how common are lawsuits in the construction industry?
Well, I don't have research or specific statistics on that, so I'm mainly responding from my experience and over my years. But, I would categorize it as, for an individual engineer or firm, it may not be common. As you said, you've been at it for 10 years and have not been named in a lawsuit. You may well go your whole career without being involved in a lawsuit. I think there is an element of luck or bad luck involved with that. It's not necessarily means whether you're a good engineer or not, or whether you've had an involvement with a lawsuit. It's certainly, that said, not something you want to become complacent about or think that it can't happen to you. I do think the design industry, professional engineers and architects, as a whole, as an industry, then you might say it is more common. There are law firms and lawyers that specialize in that field of construction defect law, so it supports an industry by itself. So, I would say individually, you can avoid it, but something to certainly always have in the forefront of your mind.
Okay, so maybe the approach we seem to take is exactly the correct one. While it's not all that likely any of us will actually be named in a lawsuit, it doesn't mean we should act as if we never will be. It goes without saying, but we should always be doing our best possible work and living up to the standard of care of the industry. Next up, if we were to be named in a suit, what are the most likely things to come up in a claim? What portions of the industry get it the hardest?
Again, from my experience, I would say it's most of the cases seem to focus around foundation movement or slab on grade movement. So that also then carries over into geotechnical engineering. And that, makes some sense because as structural engineers, we have quite a bit of control and understanding of the materials from the foundation up, or even the foundation itself. We know how steel behaves and wood behaves and concrete behaves. We can predict that for loads, but the soil that it's all sitting on, while there is a good science and understanding the behavior of that with geotechnical engineering, there's much, more unknowns and less control over what's going on below ground. So I think that's, the higher risk. As far as, types of structures or types of buildings, what I see mainly is residential projects. Single family homes are a big source of litigation, and a lot of that has to do with foundation movement, particularly here in Colorado.
I did some searching online and found that more broadly speaking, there are 3 reasons an engineer may end up in court. The first is your client claims you made a mistake. If that mistake cost your client money, you might expect a lawsuit. Considering the number of calculations done across all consultants across a large project, the likelihood of an error is not small. All you can do is check your work and have a colleague review as well when possible. Reason 2, you're accused of negligence. In this case, communication is everything. If a project is over budget or delayed, make sure to let your client know. Standard of care includes proper project oversight and meeting project specifications, not just avoiding physical harm or property damage. Reason 3 is being overextended on your obligations. Oftentimes, smaller firms need to take on a ton of work when the projects are smaller. This hurts their ability to keep up with communication, write appropriate contracts, and review projects adequately. Given all the consultants in a large project, it's no surprise that issues can arise. I wanted to ask Sam, how often in claims is the structural engineer at fault versus when they're pulled in due to someone else's error?
Again, back to multifamily residential buildings, it may start out as a building envelope issue where there's water infiltration into units or mold, or there may be cracks or delamination of stucco on the exterior due to water infiltration. So that may be the beginning of it. So a destructive testing program may be initiated by the HOA or the owner of the apartment complex. May hire a team of forensic engineers to investigate the causes and origins. And a lot of times I've seen where the cause of the cracks may be named as this not being the sole source, but saying that it contributed to an improper lateral load system for the building. That racking of the building, is also causing cracks in stucco. And then that propagates what I term a fishing expedition of engineers, then looking at the whole structural design. And then, of course, everything's fair game at that point. Anything that can be found that isn't code compliant or not meeting normal or practice or reasonable practice could then result in the structural engineer being named, and in which case you have to defend your design and make a case that it's not contributing to these true problems of the building.
How many lawsuits or threat of a lawsuit actually end up making it to court versus just settled out?
I'm pretty confident I can say are very few actually getting to a jury or court trial. Most of the time they do get settled through a mediation process or arbitration process. You always keep in mind once you're involved as to what a jury might decide. But in reality, my experience has been that that's pretty rare that it actually gets to trial.
So if we do have an issue come up, what else can we do to protect ourselves? What about those contracts we throw together for each project? Does a well-written contract protect you or help in any way?
There's no magic language that's going to keep you out of it. I would say with contracts, the most important thing is to properly identify your scope of work and be clear about what services you are providing, and as well as what you're not doing. This makes me think of a case I was involved with last year that involved the demolition of a department store at a mall, and the plan was to demolish this 3-story cast-in-place building up to the mall. It was separated by a 2-inch expansion joint, but they were going to leave the last 30-foot bay of the building, so maybe 30 feet by 6 bays long, of the building being demolished in place. So an engineer was retained by the general contractor to come up with a way to stabilize that portion of the building that was going to be left standing. And it was an engineer that they knew and they had a relationship with, and he, went ahead and did that, came up with a design, and he had a pretty simple, 1 or 2 page agreement that he wrote. And so they installed cabled X bracing in that remaining portion of the building. And in his mind, in the engineer's mind, it was very clear that what his mission was and what his responsibility was is, once you've got the building torn down and this portion of the building is left standing, I'm going to brace it so it's stable.
Yeah.
Well, there was some confusion about really what his service was, and the general contractor argued. I only back up, saying that they began demolition, and at about halfway through it, there was a domino collapse. Unfortunately, nobody was injured of the building, and it took down this brace remainder of the building, and also damaged the mall.
Ooh.
So the contractor took the position that, no, we didn't hire you just to brace the building. You were there to kind of advise us on how to demo the building, the process and the sequence, and that also once you had braced that portion of the building, that it was protected from demolition forces. As kind of far-fetched as that may sound, and then the engineer, he just didn't have very good language explaining as to exactly what he was doing and what his responsibilities were, and where those ended and where the contractors began and ended. I don't know, as an expert witness or standard of care witness, we don't always know what the outcome was. We produce our findings in a report, and we know there's a mediation that went on, but we don't always know the outcome. We may just know that it was settled. Mm-hmm. And that was the case with that. So I don't know what the outcome was, but I think that's just an example of how important it is to clearly identify what you're doing, why you're doing it, what your responsibilities are and aren't, as best you can within your contract.
Sam had a couple of other good tips here. First off, your scope should be something that a layperson would understand completely. While what we're doing can be so obvious to us that we may not represent our role very well, imagine if you found yourself in a case that did go to court and someone outside of the industry had to read your contract and understand the scope for themselves. Could they do that? Second, limitation of liability clauses exist and do hold up when your client agrees to them in the contract. These can be particularly helpful for small projects where your liability can be limited to the cost of construction and you don't need to engage your errors in emissions insurance.
Say you do end up in some sort of conflict. To what standard of care, I guess, are engineers held? That's the term I always hear, the standard of care. What does that really mean?
Well, it's a subjective definition.
Yeah.
And it varies somewhat, I think, between states. And I'm paraphrasing, but generally it centers around whatever you did or didn't do. If a reasonable engineer that was in your position, what would they have done? So did you act outside what a normal, reasonable, prudent engineer would have done? And of your peers, what would engineers in a similar situation have done or not done? And if the decision is you acted outside those bounds of reasonableness or what a prudent engineer would have done, then that falls into the category of falling below the standard of care. Normally in a lawsuit, there'll be engineers that are defending your position, and there's engineers that are on the plaintiff's side, and they'll each present an argument as to whether or not the events were below the standard of care or not. And then it falls to, if it does go to arbitration or to court, to the jury or the arbitration panel to decide based on those arguments. I will say also that it doesn't, a professional engineer does not guarantee or promise success simply by agreeing to provide professional services. So an unsuccessful outcome by itself doesn't necessarily mean that you were negligent. But so perfection isn't the bar that you have to live up to, but it gets back to this notion of what would another engineer have done in your position.
Yeah. Is that sort of the role of the expert witness to help draw the line of what the standard of care is?
It is. And that's, as I said, these things are normally not cut and dry. There's a lot of issues and circumstances surrounding whatever the problem is that's created the lawsuit. So it's the role of the expert witness, whether you're on the plaintiff or the defense side, to make your case for whether or not standard of care was met.
I wanted to ask Sam to touch on one of the more recent collapses and just walk through the process from his perspective. What's happening behind the scenes that we don't know about? Sam chose the Hard Rock Hotel collapse.
What I do know of that project is that a collapse of several floors occurred during construction. There were deaths involved with construction workers, but something that catastrophic. What I think the sequence of events is just, lawsuits come later. What's first and foremost is just taking care of the situation that's happened. Certainly, agencies like OSHA would immediately become involved, but the need to stabilize the structure, protect the public, quarantining off the streets below, and then getting experts together and trying to decide, how do we deal with this now? Do we dismantle the building completely back down? And I don't know if that was done. There's also, though, the issue of I guess you'd call it preserving evidence, so that before things start to get demolished, you'd want to do as much investigation as can safely be done or reasonably done of, photographs, drone photos, to later on try to understand and figure out what happened and why and who was responsible. I think just now, that happened about a year ago. I think just now the lawsuits are starting to, formalize on that. And we mentioned, the term shotgun, lawsuits. I mean, something like that is certainly going to involve a lot of trades and engineers and professionals that were involved with the project. Mm-hmm. So there'll be probably dozens of people named, and then this long process will carry out of investigation and depositions and of people and try to sort out who was ultimately responsible.
beyond doing our best job, trying to meet the standard of care, what can design engineers do to help protect the firm from liability?
I would say to practice what I call defendable engineering and keep that in your forefront of your mind when you're doing design. And what I mean by that is that if you were taken to task by another engineer about your calculations or your detailing in preparing the construction documents, that you can defend all your decisions, either from a standard of care standpoint or certainly by code, as you mentioned. And you can, parse that down to, I know, and maybe it's not as prevalent today, but I know, many years ago, we used to say, it was pretty common practice to say, come up with a beam design or select a beam, and you come up at the end and you say, well, it's 2% overstressed, and you go, say okay. It's insignificant.
Yeah.
But if you're taken to task on that, is it overstressed or isn't it? Show me in the code where it says you can, have a 2%, overstress in an allowable, stress design.
Yeah.
And then you might be, kind of backpedaling. And so I would say just don't even, just eliminate that, if it's 2% overstress, either go back and massage your load or your span if you really want to, try to make that work. Maybe you were being overly conservative in some other assumptions that led up to that. But don't leave that in your calculations, for example.
Yeah, I have had that conversation once with maybe even a couple times. I can recall recently we had something that was a DCR of 1, and we were saying, like, is that, is that all right? Is it like, it was right on that line. But yeah, it came to like, well, I think we rounded up the span an inch, and that now it's 99.
Right. So defendable, decisions, and just imagine yourself, if I had to defend this by another professional or a lawyer, can I comfortably?
Mm-hmm.
And then, also having good, quality control reviews that go on within your firm. And that, I'll say, doesn't have to be, as what we all kind of imagine, that somebody sits down with this completed set of documents and calculations and their cup of coffee, and then they're going to go through every word and calculation and note and detail, cross-reference and yellow everything out and, and make sure everything's perfect. My suggestion would be that it be kind of a organic, ongoing process throughout the course of a project, that a senior person or someone who maybe isn't involved intimately with the project periodically just overviews things, or you download to them, verbally what you're doing and why and what the issues are, so that you get that's the forest and the trees, right? You get someone who's not so ensconced in it that they can be looking at it in a little more of an overview way and using their experience to spot things that may become a potential problem. And I would, lump into that just constructability issues. It may be designed right, calculated right, but what you've presented in the construction documents is going to be extremely difficult, for a contractor to build. And so those, that's another important issue of our practice.
I've heard this one many times is, someone commenting on language in an email saying not to say I guarantee or this is the best design or anything that is just really absolute. Is there truth to this, or is there language that should be avoided when you're, speaking in email versus on the phone?
Well, ironically, I think I can say absolutely there is. I think that is good advice that we do. You want to avoid language, like you've said, guarantee, or words like all or every. When you're describing something, you more often want to say not all or not every, connection was inspected, things like that. And I kind of use the same test I do as I was talking about defendable engineering with anything you're putting in writing. A lot of it's emails these days. Is imagine that before you hit the send button, imagine what your email being read back to you by a lawyer in a deposition. If that makes you uncomfortable, you might want to think about rewording it or having a colleague or your supervisor, read it. Whatever the reason is that's causing you to feel uncomfortable, because emails they're wonderful, and but they're also a record, and they're discoverable if you get into a situation where you're named in a lawsuit. Your emails are going to be subpoenaed, so it's not something you have to be, paranoid about or have it, paralyze you in your day-to-day work. But again, just being mindful, because sometimes we get, you can get, particularly with a client or someone you're very familiar with, or even intercompany, right, with colleagues, you may jokingly say something or, flippantly or sarcastically, put something in an email. I would say to avoid that. Another option, if you're feeling uncomfortable about a discussion, here's a novel idea: call them. Phone calls, they're not recorded, they're not discoverable. There isn't a written record that goes along with that. So emails can help you out a lot, because you can memorialize a conversation, or that you're proceeding based on this assumption unless told otherwise. That so that there may be a clear understanding of why you went in one direction and who authorized it, and that type of thing.
One final thing I talked about with Sam is our tendency to make decisions for an owner without them knowing. A great example is the soils report. The owner engages the geotech to write a report, and it's our responsibility to interpret this information. Well, we may see 3/4 inch settlement and know this is typical for the area, or maybe even decide this isn't life safety and I don't care. What will happen if that settlement does occur and the owner's new building has cracks in the drywall? I can say we'll be the one to blame, not the geotech. So be sure you're communicating building decisions with the owner to help level expectations and make sure they know what they're getting. That's it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed the information Sam had to share. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I don't know that we'll know the answer, but we can find it for you. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.